Hello, my name is Connor Colburn, and today I'm going to be sharing a presentation on the subject of whole language. Whole language. I've entitled it Taking the Parts and Making Them a Whole. I have a question for you. What does an apple, a ball, and a cat have in common? If you say nothing at all, you're 100% correct. But that is probably how you were taught the first three letter sounds in English: A, B, and C. That is the approach that is used by most educators when teaching children to read, and we would commonly know it as phonics today. Whole language is a completely different ballgame. What is whole language? Whole language is a system that emphasizes learning to read and write naturally, as opposed to a system of learning letter sounds and grammar rules, which we again know as phonics. There's four main principles that whole language is built upon. The first is learning to read like we learn to speak. Now, no one tells us how to make basic speech sounds. I'm a linguist, but I do not explain to my 2-year-old that in order to make the T sound, he must place the tip of his tongue against the alveolar ridge, that's the area right behind your front teeth, and release air from his lungs through his throat without activating his vocal cords. That would be foolish, you'd say, and it would be, to try and teach a 2-year-old that, or my 2-month-old that. He'll learn to talk naturally. The idea with whole language is that instead of teaching rules and systems, reading develops naturally through a couple things that we're going to discuss in a bit. The second main principle that whole language is built upon is a focus on meaning more than mechanics. There's not as much focus on spelling and grammar, but more on meaningful communication, meaningful creation of language in both a written and a reading aspect. The third foundational principle is the use of authentic material. No McGuffey readers or word lists to practice, but using actual books, actual storybooks, picture books to help children learn to read naturally with authentic material. Then the fourth principle is that learning to read is integrated across subjects. So that means whether you're learning science or math or in English class or in PE class, reading is spread across all of those subjects instead of set to a 1 hour or 2 hour time period every day. We're integrating this idea of learning to read across all the different subjects that are taught. Now, what does it look like in practice? What does whole language look like when it's used in the classroom? Well, a whole language classroom may actually be very familiar to some of you. If you've spent much time in a kindergarten class or a lower grade level class, pre-K classes, a lot of daycares will structure their classrooms after this model. It's going to be a non-traditional classroom environment as opposed to our normal idea of what a classroom environment is, with rows of desks and the teacher's desk at the front, a whiteboard. But it's going to be non-traditional. It's going to include clusters of desks and chairs set up for collaborative learning. It's going to be a specifically tailored environment that is comfortable for reading in. They're going to have word walls with common words pasted on the wall with corresponding pictures to help give the definition. And there's almost always going to be a library corner with varied genres and levels of difficulty of books. So you have multiple books, multiple genres, a wide variety for students to choose from. What does whole language instruction look like? How do we actually teach whole language? How do we teach learning to read without the system of phonics? Well, big parts of it are scheduled group and individual reading time. We're encouraging reading because as they read, they are exposed to more language, they are learning the structure, they're learning the spelling. Then we also emphasize giving choice in reading material. There's no set reader, but a child can choose to read what they enjoy, choose to read what piques their interest at that time. During the group reading times, you're going to be using large picture books to give meaning to spoken and written text. You'll be following along the text as you read the book. with large pictures so the children can see, oh, this is what's going on in this book. And then they're associating what they're hearing, what the picture they're seeing, with the words on the page. Whole language instruction focuses on higher order thinking skills, the top half of Bloom's taxonomy of learning, the creating, evaluating, and analyzing aspects of learning, as opposed to the lower where it's just recall and knowledge-based and explanations. Instead, we're focusing on creating, evaluating, and analyzing language. But then we ask, how do we learn to write in a whole language environment? Surely we must use a standardized system to learn to write. Well, in the beginning, yes, we use the same system for any other way to learn to write. You practice with your letters. You start drawing out your letters and learning your letter names. But as soon as they begin writing, as soon as they have those basic mastery of writing out their letters and putting words together into sentences, they have personal choice in what they write about. There's no write 500 words on this topic. I realize 500 words would be a lot for a 7 or 8 year old. Write a paragraph on this set topic. We're giving them choice in what they get to write. And there's a limited focus on grammar and spelling mistakes. As the students are exposed to more literature through the group reading and individual reading times, they're going to learn the proper spelling of words. So they might start off spelling giraffe, G-R-F-F, giraffe. But as they're exposed to books that mention giraffes, they're going to say, oh, G-I-R-A-F-F-E is how they spell giraffe in this book. And it's going to slowly affect the way that they write, and as well as their grammar. They're going to say, oh, this is how we use this grammar point. This is when I want to make a point, I use an exclamation point. This is opposed to teaching the systems and then having them read. There's an emphasis on peer review and collaborative writing projects. That's another way that they learn to write, by observing others who may be a little bit further along than them. They can look and say, oh, they write this way, and so maybe I can write that way too. And so we're focusing on, again, creating output, not formulating output in how it has to be this exact structure that we're looking for. Apologize for the thunderstorm. It's nice typhoon season. How do we assess in whole language? Obviously, if we're not grading specific grammar points or phonics points, how do we assess whether the students are learning or not? Assessment is where whole language takes a sharp turn away from the traditional methods. Whole language assessments might include informal assessments, which we use in all stages of education, teacher notes and observations of students. We'll use developmental checklists. At a certain stage, students should be able to do certain things. So we'll use a developmental checklist to check, is the student able to read a book with limited pictures? Are they able to correctly associate what they're reading with real life? And then we'll use interviews and comprehension checks. We'll have conversations with the children. Do you understand what you read? Ask them questions. Can you answer the questions? We're checking if they comprehend the material that they're reading. Now, some historical context for the idea of whole language. It actually goes back quite a ways. Whole language dates back to the writings of Horace Mann, which if in our textbook we learned all about him, but it really only became widely popular in the 1970s and onwards. In the 1830s, Horace Mann attacked phonetic-based instruction, said it's teaching kids rules on how to write and read is not helpful. We need to teach them to read for the sake of reading. In the 1930s, the look-say method was created. Well, we would know that today as sight words, where you just see the word, and English has a lot of words that you see them and you wonder, how do I pronounce this? Sometimes you just have to learn the word. But in the 1930s is when the sight words became a big deal in the way we taught. In 1967, we have the first of the main characters or personalities in the whole reading idea, whole language sphere, and that is Ken Goodman. He publishes Reading, a Psycholinguistic Guessing Game, where he asserts that reading should be just guessing what's happening next. In the 1970s, Canadian teachers would begin to use the phrase whole language to describe their pedagogical framework, specifically to separate it from the phonetic-based learning that was happening predominantly in the United States. In 1973, Frank Smith popularized the idea that children learn to read by reading. In 1986, Goodman would publish What's Whole in Whole Language, which would serve as the textbook for instituting whole language in classrooms. By the late 1990s, whole language would be rebranded. And there was a couple reasons for this. One was it was coming under scrutiny. People were using scientific-based methods, cognitive science, to disprove some of the assertions that whole language was making. So they rebranded it as balanced literacy to try and keep the approach alive. But based on several of these surveys, studies done in the area of cognitive development, by the year 2000, Congress mandated that reading instruction must include teaching of phonemic awareness, phonetics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. This really spelled the doom of whole language as a standalone pedagogical approach in learning to read. By 2024, most states have mandated phonics-heavy approaches to teaching reading. This is, however, not the end of whole language as a pedagogical approach. Now, whole language, is it useful or is it useless? Comparing phonics-based learning with whole language, we can see whole language uses sight words, learning sight words, using context, as opposed to sounding out letter sounds to figure out what the word says in phonics-based learning. It starts with whole books, sentences, and paragraphs, real, authentic material, whereas phonics-based learning starts with letter sounds and builds up to words, then sentences, and finally you're able to read entire books. Whole language uses authentic literature, while phonics-based learning uses structured readers which contain only known letter sounds. Whole languages focuses on higher order skills, creating, evaluating, analyzing, while phonics-based learning focuses on structured fluency, accuracy, and word recognition. Now, whole language is not commonly found, but it is still used today in a number of areas. How is whole language used in the classroom today? Well, in the K1, K through 12 classroom, you won't find whole language, the name whole language anywhere. Several of the aspects of it, the collaborative environment, progressive education, student-centered learning, reading and writing across subjects, those are all aspects of whole learning that still remain in our educational system today. But how is it used today? Well, there's a couple areas that whole language is still common in. You will find aspects of whole language in several areas of education, most prominently in foreign language learning. Duolingo and Rosetta Stone are probably the two most well-known language learning platforms. Rosetta Stone only uses whole language learning. There is no grammar taught in Rosetta Stone. Right from the get-go, they never teach you structure. They just start teaching you words and phrases. Duolingo uses primarily whole language, but recently has adapted to include more phonics-related exercises. So language learning apps, foreign language learning is a popular way to continue to use whole language. In the TEFL classroom around the world, you will find whole language quite predominant. Many language learning video series on YouTube also use whole language methods to teach. Often TEFL learners already have the basics of phonics mastered in their own language, and if they use the Latin alphabet, same alphabet we use in English, a lot of those sounds are similar. So whole language works much better in that context because we're dealing from a base of knowledge. So in the TEFL classroom, you'll find whole language quite often. That genuine, authentic material, real conversations, real world applications to what they're learning. You'll also find it in the controversial but increasingly common area of unschooling. Whole language is a very prominent part of the unschooling movement. And then finally, you will see whole language used quite extensively, including in the school that I work in here in South Asia, in full English immersion schools or foreign exchange programs. In my country of Canada, in my home country of Canada, we have French immersion schools where everything is taught in the medium of French. Here in South Asia, where I work and live, the school is entirely an English environment. So we're using the whole language principle of using English across all of the subjects in order to get the real, authentic English communication learning across. Meaningful use of language, of course, is essential in learning another language. And so for adult learners especially, we find whole languages used extensively. To conclude, whole language by itself is not an effective method to teach young learners to read and write. They need the structure, they need the system of phonics to develop a good system to learn to read and write. However, taking some of the elements of whole language and combining it with traditional direct instruction and phonics creates a balanced classroom that is both student-centered, which is an important part of it, many educational visions for schools today, and accomplishes the goal, while accomplishing the goal of teaching students to read and write effectively. Whole language had its heyday, only lasted for about 30 years, but it had an impact on education that we still felt today, and especially on the foreign language aspect of learning. It is still a predominantly used system. I want to thank you for listening to my presentation. It was an interesting topic for me to cover, one that I didn't realize I would enjoy as much as I did, and I hope you found this enlightening. Hopefully you can use some aspects of whole language learning in your classroom, even though we probably won't go away from the phonics-based instruction. Science shows us that phonics-based is still one of the most effective ways to teach students to read. Thank you so much.